Welcome everybody who is interested in data governance and standardization. I'm your moderator for today, Freek Bomhoff of TNO, and there's a number of other presenters sitting here to present you with some relevant views on the topic of standardization and data governance. The agenda for today is that I will give a very brief introduction into what data governance actually is, and also how it relates to the Data Governance Act that has been recently introduced by the European Commission. Then Steven Luitjens of the JRC will report on a study that they've done, the DigiTranscope study, but it is mostly about inter-organization data governance and specifically the role that government has to play in that. Then Ray Walsh will dive deeper into what standards are relevant for data governance. And then we will have a practical example of how that works out in practice by Mark Burchell of the Musketeer Project, who will tell about what they encountered when they were working with data governance and standards. The meeting is scheduled to be, the presentations are scheduled to be finished more or less by 10 after 3, so that we have some 20 minutes for a Q&A. Of course, when you have a question during the presentation, especially if it's a question like, I didn't fully understand that one or whatever, just put it in the chat, or right after the session, you can have a very quick round of questions. But the real discussions that are meant to be more in-depth, we would like to reserve them for the end of this session. Okay, so I will now briefly introduce this session by looking into the topic of data governance itself. What may be relevant is my background is that I'm working with TNO in the data science research group. I'm a consultant there. So I've seen quite a number of different data projects, both successful and less successful. And within the BDVA, I'm leading the task force on policy and regulation. So that's also more on the organizational parts of everything that we do with data. So I hope that this is a more or less relevant background for this. First, the scope of the session. So data governance, yeah. There's the Data Governance Act, so that's the part of data governance that has now been regulated by the European Commission. And we also address standards, because if you want to do something meaningful in practice, it's usually extremely helpful to have standards that help you to rely on the thinking work that people have done before, and that also enables you to communicate much more easily and without noise with other people. So this session is really on the intersection of these three topics, and it is also a little bit of an experiment because Ray Walsh and we are both active in the BDVA, and we said, what would happen if we would combine the topic of data governance and the topic of standards? So far, it has not received that much attention. So we are very curious what we end up with if we put these two topics on the same table at the same time in this session. So we may find white spots or black spots or things that really need some attention. So this is also a kind of an exploratory session today, where we are also very curious about your questions and your observations. So we may have found a very interesting and relevant topic here in this session to address both data governance and standards at the same time. Okay. Briefly continuing, what is data governance? It's a very broad discipline. You can find lots of definitions and lots of papers and publications about it. There's the Data Management Association that has adopted data governance as a subject. We took one quite good review article from literature, and they define data governance as a cross-functional framework to manage data as strategic enterprise assets. So that involves decision rights and accountabilities for the organization. And it also formalizes data policies, standards, there you have it, and procedures, and also monitors compliance. So what they did, they reviewed 145 articles on data governance. That's quite a lot, mostly between 2013 and 2019. They were not specifically focusing on big data or AI, but given the importance of data for AI, we have assumed that their findings also have 100% validity for AI data governance as well. So they created a structure to structure all of the content that you can address when you are talking about data governance. And diving deeper into this, they said, well, the core is the governance mechanisms, and that is what usually people also understand when they talk about data governance. So that is everything that has to do with the structures and the procedures and also the relational mechanisms. How do you actually do things when you are doing data governance? So that's at the center of their model. You have the organizational scope, and that is everything that needs to be organized in order to make data governance work. And there is intra-organizational and inter-organizational. Very often people only think of intra-organizational. What do I have to organize within my own organization? But for this session, the inter-organizational scope is the most important one. What do I need to organize when I want to collaborate using data with others? The data scope itself is everything that has to do with the data itself. So that is both traditional data and big data, and that also involves things like data standardization and data quality and metadata and everything. Of course, you also have the domain scope. That is everything that is domain specific. And that also involves things like security, the specific architecture that you have for this domain, the data lifecycle, and many other things there. Then there are the contingency factors. That's your environment, the antecedents. So everything that influences how data governance is operated. There are both internal and external antecedents. The Data Governance Act is one such external antecedent. So that is something which is external to your organization, but it really influences how you approach the topic of data governance. And then finally, of course, that's the consequences part of data governance, where you can look at performance effects. So what does it do for my organization? What does it do for my value chain? But also risk management. What can go wrong if you neglect data governance? So what happens if you look at this structure and when you look at the Data Governance Act at the same time? And the blue circles, they indicate where in this structure the Data Governance Act plays a role. And on the upper left, you see, of course, the legal and regulatory requirements within the antecedents scope. That's very obvious. In the organizational scope, you see that data governance between firms and ecosystems, the parts of data governance there is really touched upon by the Data Governance Act as well. Metadata is mentioned by the Data Governance Act, and the governance mechanisms themselves are quite impacted as well. So that includes roles and responsibilities and where decision-making authorities are, especially for those parts that are covered by the Data Governance Act, of course. But it also includes policy standards, processes and procedures. Compliance monitoring is an important part of the Data Governance Act, and also some communication. I will not go into these articles here on this slide on a one-by-one basis, but these slides will be made available after the presentation. So if you're curious which parts of the Data Governance Act could influence your data governance activities, well, these are the articles that are most important. So it's a kind of guiding a list for this topic when you want to see how the Data Governance Act influences your data governance activities. And what you can see is that especially policies, standards, processes, and procedures, well, they are commonplace in the Data Governance Act. You find them in many different articles to be addressed. And this is already my very last slide. So the conclusion on the relation between the Data Governance Act and the Data Governance Framework is that, well, there is quite a small number of activities that are actually impacted by the Data Governance Act. So there's many things about data governance that are not in the regulation, but there are a number of things that are impacted. It's mostly inter-organizational agreements and internal organizational issues that you really need to pay attention to. Some things about data definitions, also data quality, data security, and performance effects. They are all things that are not really impacted. And it's also good to note that the Data Governance Act addresses topics that you normally do not see in data governance as an activity, like, for instance, the European Data Board that oversees how the Data Governance Act, how it works in practice, and many other things as well. So this was a very quick introduction to set the scene. I hope that I haven't been too quick for you. But it was just meant as a brief introduction, and I'm now happy to introduce to you the second speaker of today, and that is Steven Luitjens. As I just said, he has been concluding work from the JRC, the Joint Research Council of the European Commission, and they have been specifically looking into the role of digitization on collaboration between organizations. So that's this data governance, which is inter-organizational, and specifically the role of government in it. So if there are no urgent and pressing questions, and also looking at the time, I would now like to invite Steven to share his screen and to tell us more about this topic.
Thank you very much. Steven Luitjens. My home base is the Dutch Ministry of the Interior and Kingdom Relations, where I've been in various management functions with regard to digitization over the years. And after a sabbatical some 3 years ago now, I decided to focus on projects that I think are relevant and nice to do. And one of these projects has been the DigiTranscope project, an exploratory research project of the GRC that was concluded at the end of last year. And the report on that was published in March. So it's quite recent. And I would like to tell you some of the contents of the report.
Hey, Stephen, we can't see your screen.
You can see my screen.
No, can you share, please?
Oh, that's... Let me see. Where did I go wrong? You can't see it now?
Not yet, no.
Then I have to go back. And now?
Not yet. The joys of live webinars.
Yes.
Okay, so this is what we prepared for. Okay. Yeah.
This is okay?
Yes, you can see it now. Thank you.
Well, then you almost missed my beautiful first picture. So good that you intervened. I'd like to tell you something about the results of the project and the reasons behind the project. So I will give, I think, some context to the whole question of data governance as it is now being introduced by the European Commission. Because one of the nice things about this research was this was so hot that even during the research, which wasn't meant to be, but it still happened, the Commission was already implementing certain recommendations. And so the Governance Act was quite influenced by the research that I was part of. I started some time ago, and I took this picture just to show you how far ago I started. And Freek just mentioned before the session started that he was delighted seeing this picture, not because of the man with the beautiful beard who popularized digitization in the Netherlands over the years, but especially because the building behind the picture is the first building where Freek had his first job, I think. But well, that was the way in which we looked at the future back then, and that was, I think, in the 1990s. So things have been going extremely quick over the years, and one of the things that I'm specializing in can be seen here. I have many situations in which people don't understand the first thing about what the other is telling you. And that was also my role during this particular research project, being the liaison between, on the one hand, all sorts of researchers. And it was a very transdisciplinary research. So even talking between scientists among themselves was very difficult at the start. But our ambition went further. So I did a lot of workshops in the various member states with, on the one hand, scientists, and on the other hand, politicians, policymakers, civil servants, and people from industry. And this was the kind of discussion that you get when you try to include all those various viewpoints into one discussion. But it really brought us a lot. Research was meant to be exploratory in the sense that we accepted that every one of us was totally amazed with regard to what is happening in the world, especially with regard, of course, to digitization. And one of the concerns at the start was this is all quite driven by industry, and especially American industry, if you try to ignore China, which we shouldn't. But the real question was, well, what's in it for us? What's in it for society? What's in it for individual people, for SMEs, etc., etc.? So that was the starting point of the research. And we said, well, we can do, of course, all sorts of desk research, and we did a lot of desk research. But the real trick is to start experiencing what's going on in society. So it was an exploration, but we also decided to do a lot of experiments. And many of these experiments have been done in Holland, by the way, especially in the Johan Cruyff Arena in Amsterdam, which is an innovation lab, apart from being a football stadium. And there we did all sorts of experiments with crowd management, with engaging young people in digitization, old people in digitization, etc., etc. Simply in the beginning to start understanding how they relate to everything that is happening in the world, apart from them being heavy users of iPhones, etc., etc. But do they actually understand what's going on? And we did especially experiments with so-called digital twins. We provided a digital twin of the city of Amsterdam, for example, done in Minecraft to start discussions among young people how to have a sustainable city, what choices can be made, and what the consequences of the various choices are. And this appeared to be an extremely effective way to engage them in the future of the city using IT. So I was really quite delighted of the promise of these kind of applications to well, really to improve democracy. And we also made some synthetic populations. So we tried to get behind the technology and start acting as if we were Google or one of the other major platforms. But we didn't actually use data on individual people. We created persona and using all the data, all the open data that we already have at least in the Netherlands, we were able to experiment with really targeted policy making. So not policies for a whole city, but in fact policies for certain areas within the city and even certain streets within the city. All kinds of possibilities occurred. And everything we did was trying to find an alternative paradigm to see whether we can come to a way of working that is really rooted in the European values and even in the fundamental human rights that we cherish in the Netherlands and in the other member states. And we were trying to seek ways to have a fairer distribution of the value that all these data are generating. But it remains an exploratory research. So if you really want to make a policy on this, you should continue such a research, and especially explore ways to well, to scale up, because that's still a great problem. What we found was a real gap between two things: the everyday perspective, as I have called it here, and the systemic perspective. Because from an everyday viewpoint, all this technology allows us to live very comfortably, apparently, and that we are in all sorts of bubbles, and that we are manipulated, even if we don't know it. It still is a way, a very effective way for individual people to deal with all their fears and uncertainties. And I don't have to tell you that society as such is squeaking and creaking at the moment. So fears and uncertainties are all over the place. And we didn't have the presidential elections yet in the US, and we didn't have Corona, at least only at the end of the research. But these two situations have been really great illustrations as to what is actually happening in society. But from an everyday life perspective, apparently nobody is worried. When you take a systemic view, then you really get worried, because what has been promised for decades is now actually happening. All these systemic disruptions of socioeconomic structures, revenue models, and even the power balance in society worldwide. As I said, industry is driving this revolution, and we are bystanders, apparently not in a situation or not feeling the need to do anything at all. But at the same time, you see very serious consequences, and there is a lot of research being done on that. When you look at distribution of wealth, inequalities, even solidarity, the future of work, etc., etc. So this is really a major thing now, and I think the new European Commission has been very wise to see the digital transformation of society as one of their two top priorities, together with of course climate. We found out that without ignoring all these beautiful small-scale experiments like data cooperatives, etc., etc., the dominant strategies in datafication are at the moment quite different. And they come from the US, they come from China, and they come from all sorts of other countries. And we distinguished in the end 3 of these strategies. The first is the strategy to maximize financial profits. And this is what the US Big Five is doing, and is doing very effectively, apparently. Making gigantic amounts of money with their privately owned platforms, and going very far indeed to do this without any regulation whatsoever. And when there is regulation, like the GDPR, they apparently simply ignore it. And what does the European Commission do? Well, they give all these fines, and we have this discussion on the tax. But apparently this is such a profitable game that they pay the fines and they just go on doing what they're doing. So one of my theses has been during one of the workshops, I think it's either one of 2 things. Either we stop with the GDPR, or we really start demanding compliancy, and that is not giving these companies fines. That is more having a discussion on their license to operate in the EU as such, or try to split up these firms in order to reduce the power they now have over society. Maybe a beautiful discussion topic for later during this session. The second one is maximizing political control. China is the champion in doing that. And I think you all know the stories as how far this goes in China by now. And that's not the kind of society I think that we would like to have in the EU. And the last one is actually the most dangerous one. For a long time we thought it was part of the first 2, but in the end we decided no, it should be mentioned separately. And that is the strategy to maximize confusion. And that is what is actually happening with all these stately actors like Russia, like North Korea, like Iran, trying to create massive insecurity, distrust, and outright chaos, because apparently their major objective is to destabilize societies. And I'm very worried about the effectiveness with which this is going on. And this is going even further every day, so to speak. Just to speed up things, because
I was about to suggest that. Okay.
I understand. And we will share the slides so we don't have to go through everything. My main point is that what is needed is a more proactive government. The US companies actually question whether there is any role for government in the future as such. And in this research, we have concluded that there is a major role for government to play. And at the moment, they're doing it very badly because they don't understand what's going on. They think this is all about the free market. And they ignore that it's no longer just about the free market in economic terms. It's about the free society. So that makes one of the points on the agenda, how to make European governments fit for purpose. And one of the first things you have to do then is that you have to understand that you're fighting in the wrong quadrant. This is a topic that is always in the quadrant of important, not urgent. And we actually think that it should be in the quadrant important and urgent. because a lot of things that have been going on will not be so easily to revert in the future. So hopefully, another nice topic to discuss later on is whether the Data Governance is not the Data Governance Act is not too late. And so I come to my take-home messages. I have not been trying to engage you in a discussion as to whether or not we should embrace these developments. This is here to stay. And many beautiful things can be done with it, but many bad things can also happen. And it's about governments that should fully understand the dynamics and know which buttons to turn. So the question is the Data Governance Act one of these effective buttons that we can turn? Because it's actually about regaining sovereignty. Sovereignty on data, it's about control over data. And at the moment, we have no control whatsoever over data. And that goes for governments, but that goes for individual people in particular. And it's about safeguarding a resilient and inclusive society because all the trends that I just mentioned about inequality, etc., and I didn't go into the question of vulnerability, means that resilience and inclusiveness are really under fire. And the last thing is not discrediting meetings like this, but we shouldn't go on just discussing these topics. We really should start acting. That's it for now. Looking forward to the next speakers, and hopefully I've given you some context and some insights into the DigiTranscope project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven. Thank you for especially, I like these take-home messages, plus your provoking remark that maybe we're already too late with the Data Governance Act. But on the other hand, I really like your comparison to the car, because this is indeed something where regulation is always needed, standardization is needed. And it was only in the 70s that it was officially forbidden to drink and drive. And the son of the Minister of Transport in the Netherlands had to be killed before this law was adopted. So also there you see that sometimes you are too late, but still I think we're going into the right direction. So eventually in the digitization area, we will be able to do the same. So thank you for this image as well. Yeah, and indeed, looking at the time, I think it's good to move on with Ray from the Dublin City University and also the EU Observatory for ICT Standards to talk a little bit more about how this standardization, how it then works out exactly if you want to look at data governance. So Ray, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Freek, and thank you, Stephen. At this stage, I would actually prefer not to have to give my presentation because Stephen's talk was so thought-provoking. I'd just like to have a conversation. And now I'm regretting this isn't a panel session and that I actually have to do a presentation at all. So thanks for that, Stephen. Data space and data standards. Okay, so these are two things that are very close to my heart, and there's a lot of work going on in this space in relation to various projects that I'm working on, not least in relation to the work I do with BDVA and with Freek. So what I'm going to do is do a sort of I was having a look at where would be best to pitch this particular talk. So what I knew Freek was going to do an intro to governance, and Stephen was going to be more sort of applied from a regulation point of view. So I said I'd pitch mine so I have standards, but linking the two talks together to a certain extent. So I'm going to skip through things like data spaces and EU privacy, federated data projects, data governance, standardization then as a linkage here between these various topics and expanding into metadata standards and semantic data, and build that picture so that we can have a talk about it, or at least get people to think about the concept of data governance and position it in the setting that Stephen has just actually been speaking about. And where I wanted to start with first was like just to, talk about the spaces themselves, like data spaces and And we've heard all these terms. We've heard, in BDVA, we hear iSpaces, and you hear about data lakes and data warehouses. And the first thing we need to do is try and come up with a sort of a common vocabulary to talk about these various things and put them in perspective. And we've got innovation hubs and digital innovation hubs and European digital innovation hubs. And these are all mechanisms and instruments which will use data and which have, as part of their core tenet, to allow the sharing of data, but in a controlled and structured manner so that people can have access to it and feel that even being open with certain types of data, that it's in an environment where that the trust can be maintained, that we have transparency, and you can still maintain privacy. And one of the big issues, I suppose, with trying to have privacy and also to have utility is that it's a spectrum, that we can have the best of privacy, that we keep all our information to ourselves and then we get no utility from it. We cannot be proactive with it. Or we can make it freely available, in which case we have no privacy because everybody has it. And what you really want is control where you can have maximum privacy, but also maximum utility. And that's going to be a sliding scale. So this sort of slide in is just to get people thinking about, well, it's quite a broad landscape we're talking about. And if you look at even just the digital innovation hubs there in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, they're spread all over Europe and they all are large entities in themselves. And if we want to have a federated data sharing environment, then we need to have entities like these digital innovation hubs communicating together, potentially through regulatory sandboxes, but even if it's not, there's no regulation aspect to it, but still to have a controlled, robust, secure private network for monetizing the data that they're working on, irrespective of whether it's a horizontal technology you're working with, like cloud or 5G or big data smart cities, or whether it's a vertical in manufacturing or healthcare or automotive, etc. And Stephen already talked about, as did Freek actually, introduced like where we are in relation to regulation coming out of Europe. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that there is regulation in this space and the Parliament will be issuing more as time goes on. And that we need to be aware that there are restrictions as to what you can do with data. And if you do, everybody's aware of GDPR, but the processing of your own personal data, that needs to be managed in a controlled manner. Free movement of personal data where it's sensible and where there is utility needs to be controlled and needs to be monitored. And the right, and this is key, like, because it's all about rights and responsibilities, the right to the protection of your personal data. That even if you give with good conscience your data to a third party for some purpose, you still have a right. You have not given away your rights. You still have a right to that protection of your personal data. And in order for this to happen, there is going to be a monitoring capability and necessary. Some people say this as necessary evil, but you cannot measure unless you monitor. So there is this necessity for monitoring. Also, we want to be able to reuse, in particular, public data, because there's all this governmental data, which is stored by ourselves. And we want to be able to make better policy and strategy decisions based on that data. We want to be able to, if we are going to share using third parties, that we can trust that intermediary, that there is some mechanism being set up which allows those intermediaries to be allocated in a controlled manner and with some responsibility being given, but also regulation in that space. And GDPR then backs that up. So I won't spend any time on GDPR because that's going to be covered all over the place. But there's also the data use on altruistic grounds. And that's part of the Data Governance Act as well. That you can choose, large companies can choose to say, well, look, this data, I want to make this completely available, no holes, no restrictions, and it's for the good of society. And then the Governance Act actually allows for that to happen as well. And also just to wrap up the Commission's approach to it, look at, we're talking about producers and consumers, like so data producers, data consumers, that needs to be some mechanism for conformity, and that means control. There needs to be layers of interaction with that control. So the Commission is talking about data protection officers and data protection supervisors that provide this independency this monitoring capability, but also with authority and with responsibility. So that's giving a background sort of more on the legal aspect and from a legislation point of view, what's coming out of the Parliament. This is to get the discussion going on, well, let's say I'm a user. What does this mean for me? So why should I be interested in this? Well, first of all, you have to consent to share any of your data. Consent to share is core to having a free society where we can safely, securely, transparently, openly, but privately also be able to look after the sharing of data. We have a right to control that data, control that personal data. We can devolve some of those rights through anonymization, so long as that the personal data is not exposed. And we have the core tendencies of privacy, trust, and transparency, which are required to be satisfied to facilitate data sharing in a controlled manner. And as I said earlier, we have this balancing act on the spectrum between utility, so getting some use out of our data, and privacy, protecting our personal data. So with that in mind then, there is work going on to try and build mechanisms, structures, tools, technologies, standards, which I'll get to later, to allow companies, governments, and individuals to share data in a pan-European manner. And we have EU hubs for data, which is looking at, again, federation via the digital innovation hubs and data innovation hubs. DECSIS, which is this federated data sharing environment started by the French and German governments, but now going pan-European with other national DECSIS hubs being rolled out. And that's providing a data infrastructure, a federated data infrastructure to allow data sharing, both, again, through horizontal technologies across horizontal technologies, but also in vertical areas, sectors, sectoral areas as well. And it's bringing European member states together in order to do that. With a number of the core tenets there spelled out front and center: openness, transparency. Without either of which you can't have trust. The International Data Spaces Association then, we work with in BDVA as well. Sovereign systems of data exchange. So this is putting the European perspective and applying data sharing infrastructures with European values in a secure, private, and safe way. And the governance landscape is very wide. And this is just looking at data governance. But you'll see the usual suspects appearing there in terms of the terminologies, definitions, from the legal perspective, from the corporate accountability perspective, from a government perspective, from a compliance and standards perspective. This is the landscape we're dealing with. What is data governance? And Freek already has mentioned and gave us the opening a view of that, and in very detailed, set the stall out at the very start. But I'm going to break that down into something that, from a user perspective, what can you dig out of that, make it simpler for people to understand? And I'd say rights and responsibilities. Rights and responsibilities. What actions can be taken? Who can take those actions? And with what data? And when you tie all of that together, then that's data governance. And that can be broken out into its constituent parts: trustworthiness and reliability and robustness and privacy and safety and security, dependability, transparency, all of those things. But if you satisfy the rights and responsibilities of data governance, then you are covering all of that. You're generating trust, you're creating reliability, you're providing security, and you're doing it in a means that is dependable and transparent. And with all that said, I should be selling standardization because that's where I do most of my work. But after I set the scene out, then we need some way of measuring up to whether or not we're doing this correctly. What is the benchmark? Where is the threshold? And this is something that standards actually gives us. Standards allows us to create certification mechanisms, to generate regulations for European Parliament, and also to to provide a sound foundational basis for legislation as well. This is what standards do. Standards are part of the innovation life cycle. You get, I'll go on a little bit of a tangent here for just 2 minutes, but the innovation life cycle involves that you have this research and development, and then you come up with the next big thing, and then there's this chaos because people are trying to say, well, I'm going to build it, no, I'm going to build it, I'm going to build it, and then you get all of these competing solutions coming out, and then standards comes in and says, well, actually, what we'll do is we'll take the best, most stable solution and we'll standardize it, and then that dampens down all of this chaos, and you start getting internationalization, you get portability, you get interoperability. And then when that's all just dampened down, then some other bright spark comes along and there's the next bit of innovation, more research, another explosion, another innovation, and we start the whole process over again and we re-standardize the next big thing. And that goes on forever, it just keeps going. So as part of that innovation, then we come up with standardization which is it's an international way of agreeing what is best practice. That's what standards are. They're living documents that grow with the technology and adapt as time goes on through various revisions. For data and data spaces, data first, we have Working Group 2 of the Subcommittee 42, which is Artificial Intelligence, of the Joint Technical Committee of ISO, the International Standards Organization, and IEC, the International Electrotechnical Council. They have a working group just specifically called data. And we've already published, I was an editor on of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 documents they were published. I was editor on 4 of them. 20546 was edited by Nancy Grady. That's terms and definitions associated with big data. Part 1 is on using big data reference architecture. 20547 Part 2 is on use cases for big data. And 20547-3, which I was lead editor for, is the big data reference architecture. So it's all about data, about the functional view, the user view, data providers and data consumers. And last but not least, the 20547, not 4547, there's an extra 4 in there. Part 5 is on, standards roadmap. So it looks at all standardization in that space globally. And in progress, then we have a number of other data spaces. Data standardization. Data spaces standardization is a nice heading there. It's just to get people thinking. But there is no data spaces standardization at all at the moment. What there is some constituent parts. But within BDVA, actually, and this is something that's only recently started as part of the standardization group within BDVA, we're looking at data space standardization. So in conjunction with a couple of colleagues of mine, Antonia Kuhn and Rigo Venning, who are also from a standardization background. Antonia works with SC41 and Rigo works with W3C. We're looking at ways of coming up with data space standards. In other words, when you want to create data space standards, you need to look at metadata. You need to look, how can we communicate things and get them to work better together? But before I go on to that, I'll just say that in progress at the moment, or under study, we have process management frameworks for data analytics. We have a number of documents on data quality not just for analytics, but also for machine learning. We're looking at standards for the data lifecycle for AI, data quality, and AI data, which is like a concept that there's specific connotations associated with data when it's in an AI context. I disagree with that completely, by the way. I don't believe that exists, but it's there. There's a working group there, and every time so they discuss something, I say, no, there is no such thing as AI data. There is just data. Everything else is context. But anyway, that's my rant. Semantic interoperability then is another part of that whole picture. So that we need to have not just have metrics and atomic data being sent back and forth. We need to provide some semantic or knowledge representation there. And the only way to do that really is with metadata, to describe the data so that in one nice tidy package, you get information and you also get the context as part of the deliverable. And that's self-contained, so it can be, it's very, very portable. Data interoperability and requires this shared meaning. So both ends of that discussion, or it's not just both because it can be many-faceted, but the ends of the discussion all share the same meaning. And this will allow for computational tasks to be carried out in the data for knowledge discovery. And again, metadata is the key to that and provides mechanisms for deep diving down into what's been shared. And the semantic web then allows some part of that, and this is W3C's area, which Rigo would be better to talk about, but I just throw in a few of the recognized RDF and OWL, which are recognized as sort of standards for enabling linked data, linked open data, and semantic interoperability on the web. And in terms of Ireland then and data governance, just I throw in some national perspectives, because then what we need to do as governments is to look at our own AI strategies. Do we have one? Again, if we don't, then why don't we? And do we have a data governance strategy? Because AI and data will be tightly tied together for the next 15 years. What about standards and research in that space, in data governance? Is there anything happening in that regard? Now, all of these are initiatives that are happening in Ireland at the moment. So we have national AI strategies, data governance strategies. We've got research centres that are specifically in the data governance and standards research area. We're looking towards EU federated data sharing initiatives. In other words, we're involved in GAIA-X. And we're regularly informing and I suppose expanding on the discussion in relation to standards, regulation and legislation from a European perspective, and looking at our national initiatives in that space as well. So how are we setting ourselves up for compliance for what's coming down the track? Okay. And that's it for me. So that's a sort of a quick one-stop shop about data governance, linking in standards, talking about from a regulation point of view and from a science and research point of view, but maybe in maybe a more accessible way. I hope at least that there's something for everybody in that particular talk. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. And indeed, something for everyone, because the topic is so broad that you can always have something to be concerned about or to really dive into. I'm curious how complete everything is that we're currently doing, but that's probably something for after this session to have a discussion on. Yeah, and I would then like Mark to present their work in the Musketeer project, expecting to also learn how it works when you actually work with standards and in the context of a project like Musketeer. So, Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Freak. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, Mark, but you need to flip between your presenter view and, because we can see the next slide as well, the small next slide.
Yeah, okay.
You just change the setting. Thanks.
Any better?
No, you have to swap at the top of the screen there. It should be a way of switching between, when you go to full screen mode, it should allow you to switch between presenter mode and just a preview mode or something, or what it's called. You see the 4 buttons in the top left, Mark? You have end show, tips, and then there's switch. Sorry, gone. Just put it in slideshow again, Mark. Now you have 4 options above the timer. Swap displays, 2 arrows, top left. That's it, perfect.
Okay, there we go.
Wow. Yeah,
I'm not an expert on Zoom, so. Anyway, okay, so my name is Mark Purcell, and I'm the IBM Technical Coordinator for the Musketeer H2020 project. As Freak said, it's going to be a technical example, a practical example of inter-organizational data governance. So hopefully it should be useful continuation of the discussion. So what is the Musketeer project? So we're primarily focused on federated machine learning, but it's also identified in the call for the project that there's kind of there's not enough, there aren't many platforms that provide enough trust and security in order to do this. And I'll get into the detail of that more in a second. So it's a three-year project, and we're coming into the closing few months of it at the moment. And again, I'll highlight some of the various points we touched on during the project in a few minutes. And there you'll see all the project partners, and IDSA is there mentioned that Ray talked about a few minutes ago. They're providing a valuable contribution in the standardization aspects of this. And we're looking at primarily two use cases. So one is in healthcare and one is in smart manufacturing. And again, I'll be able to highlight them in a second. So some of the things we're really looking at is, so I've mentioned federated learning, and again, it's across organizations and specifically on a global level. So we really could be talking about various different organizations collaborating to build a machine learning model, geographically dispersed. To support that, there's a suite of privacy-preserving algorithms, which we call the Musketeer Machine Learning Library. And in principle, everything always operates on data that never moves from their own premises. So there's in fact no sharing of underlying data per se. There is in fact sharing of model updates. Again, I'll get into that in a second. And we're also building a mechanism whereby we can assign some data value estimations to the model contributions from various different federated learning participants, which should lead the way towards a more work in the data economy for machine learning. You'll see in this slide, it's a pretty typical looking project really in terms of structure. We have on the left-hand side, very important work and legal and technical requirements. And that's particularly from a government's perspective, actually. Most of the packages are technical. And then, of course, we do have project management and dissemination and obviously the use cases. So I suppose it's worth talking about what exactly is federated learning. So in this particular case, I'm going to show an example of the difference between typical machine learning and federated learning. So we're using here the MNIST dataset, which is a large collection of handwritten digits in various different people's handwriting. And the idea is to, when given one, to be able to, a model to predict, well, which digit is it? So in a typical scenario for machine learning, you may have organization one that has, only 0 to 4 digits. Organization 2 has 5 to 9 digits. And organization 3 may have 3 to 7. So if you look at when they see number 2, the prediction from organization 1 will be correct because they do actually have that in their training data set. For organization 2, they don't have number 2, so they're predicting incorrectly. And same for organization number 3, they will also predict incorrectly because they don't have the data in their data set. Again, the data always remains on-prem here, so it's traditional machine learning. Now, if we want to look at what happens if you introduce federated machine learning into the mix, what we get in this sense is all 3 organizations can operate via what we call an aggregator. They can all provide the outputs of their local model training to produce an aggregated model. This aggregated model will then be shared back to each of the individual participants. So now they're all operating off training with their own individual data, but they have reaped the benefit of a shared federated training procedure to have a better model. With this better model, even though they only have the same data, they can now predict accurately what the digit was in front of them, even though they don't have it in their own local data sets. So it's a very powerful mechanism to employ by using, but not actually having even access to the data from other organizations. In Musketeer, this is what it looks like. So we can have multiple organizations, all have their own data. All the data is, accessed via local policies and local governance rules, etc. But we can advertise essentially that one organization wants to build a model, understands they don't want to compromise any proprietary information from neither themselves or anybody else. And other organizations can see that this federated learning task is underway, and they can in fact recognize that they have data that would be able to contribute to an improved model and will participate. What this looks like in practice then is that we have a Musketeer cloud platform which we use primarily for federated learning interoperability. So it understands how to route between various different organizations, and also to maintain a lineage of the model. So when you have a final model, you can in fact look at what contributed to build this model. And again, I'm not talking about data, because the data always remains on-prem for each individual contributor, but what forms of contributions in terms of model updates were received from different organizations. So again, we can see at this layer here, the data is always accessed by whatever policies are in place locally. And at this layer is the interoperability between participants. The aggregator is a federated learning process, effectively, which fuses the model updates from the various different participants. Again, the model updates, you wouldn't have any underlying data. It's just basically a trained model from 3 different sets of data, which will be aggregated together, dispersed back to the individual participants at their organization sites. In terms of standards, as I said, IDSA have been involved since the start, and we've always placed a very large emphasis on using both open standards, but also as many open source products and packages that we can. So if we can see here, we're using things like RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, Object Store. Plus, we've also contributed quite a bit back to the open source community from some of the work that we've done on the project. In terms of standards, everything is fairly standard. We use HTTPS, AMQP for messaging. Data will be structured usually JSON, and everything is quite secure. It all uses very secure cloud, well-known packages and products for interoperability, all backed by secure sockets layer and TLS 1.4. We also have most of our components trying to adhere as much as possible to the IDSA reference architecture, be that in form of data applications or indeed service brokers. So where we've come from really is here's a timeline of the project to this point. So we started back in 2018, which now seems like a long time ago. We got to the first stage of a prototype with the Musketeer machine learning library and interoperability across geographic regions a year later. We were able to use this then to showcase that actually working in the mid-project review, which was actually very successful. For a research and innovation project, to have something running at that stage was deemed very interesting. And we also then used that platform in a hackathon where we had a number of external entities involved in testing out some machine learning on the platform across several geographies. This same platform was recognized on the EU Innovation Radar just earlier this year for a high level of technology readiness and a strong market creation potential in federated learning. Where we're going later in this year, we've just actually this month made some more open source releases, and towards the end of the year, then we're going to have another hackathon, which will focus on more of the security and privacy and data aspects of the platform. Then towards the end of the year, the project will be complete with a final review in November. And some of the next steps that we've been thinking of is how does this apply a lot more towards the Data Governance Act, which was mentioned earlier on, but also in terms of scalability. So how can we look at what we have? And as I said, the scaling so far has been mainly up to maybe 50 participants. How could we bring that to another level where it may be applicable in an edge case scenario where there could be thousands of participants? Maybe IoT is an example. Who knows? That's one of the things we're looking at. But also overall in terms of security and privacy to ensure that federated platforms like this are going to be quite useful going forward. And thank you. That's an overview of Musketeer, where we've come from, and roughly where we're going. And I'm very happy to participate in the conversation and take some questions. And luckily, I can answer all the technical questions, so that should be no problem.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that was very good to see that you can also have a way of working with data without actually having the data leave the house, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So that could be another take towards data governance, which immediately, and I'm happy that you're already addressing that scaling up and having federated learning across many, many different organizations. What is your opinion? Do you already have enough support from standards to achieve the situation that you say, well, I want to do federated learning, but I do not know all of the participants in this area. So can you do some ad hoc federated learning? Do you already have enough backup from standardization, or do we still have some work ahead of us there?
Well, I think there's some work still ahead of us, which, is never a bad thing, of course. Right? We don't always have all the answers. But, there were certain decisions that were made during the project to handle things like interoperability. So, when we want to make sure that the data doesn't leave premises, but also in terms of privacy, we've also wanted to make sure that the participant's identity is also private. Mm-hmm. So, for example, that means if you're at a very technical level now, if you're trying to communicate with another party across the internet, that opens up several issues, right? So, there's all kinds of attacks that can happen on a connection like that. So what we've tried to do is, use a service broker mechanism whereby at the very worst case scenario, there's always at least 2 network hops. Again, I'm getting a bit technical here, right? There's always a couple of network hops in the mix, and also that your identity is protected because nobody makes a direct connection to your location where your data resides. So both your data is protected and your identity is protected. So I think these are important considerations that could feed into some of the data standardization discussions that we're going to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to piggyback on that one, as Mark said, and it follows on from what's coming out of the regulation as well, is because this has the potential of creating this trusted intermediary, which is actually built into the regulation. So mm-hmm. you have a way of getting the utility, being able to engage, external to your premise, but still having that trusted environment.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Also, look, I'm curious what the audience think of some of the more provocative statements, like, for instance, the one that Steven voiced, that he said, well, we might even think that the Data Governance Act was too late. And so, yeah, I'm curious what the audience think of this, so you can react to that in the chat window on the WooFA platform when you're using it. But I'm also curious to see what the other speakers think of that. So, for instance, Mark, what do you think of the Data Governance Act? Was it too early or too late or just in time? Too big, too small? What do you think of it?
Well, kind of as I touched on at the end, we're only really, again, my side is always going to be technical, looking at that from where we're going now. So as I said, the project was a research and innovation action. So, it's looking at very kind of fundamental things about federated learning. So the Data Governance Act wasn't exactly, the first topic on our minds, right? Because we had to figure out, is there any practical way we can do this at all, right? So, I think it's, it's still perfectly relevant, and we are some way away from building European-wide federated platforms. So I think it's, ideal timing to be talking about these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Disagree.
Disagree. Okay, come on.
No, disagree. Too late. It's too late. I mean, it should have happened years ago. Data Governance Act should have happened years ago. It's unfortunately our priorities at European level has been the wrong way around. We got GDPR, created a regulation without any way of enforcing it. No standard. There was nothing to actually measure, no measurement against which the GDPR could have been held accountable at that regulation. And it was after the fact that we had data commissioners and we had this reactionary approach to trying to make GDPR work, and we've ultimately got to where Stefan mentioned it at the outset. Do we forget about GDPR, and just throw our hands up in the air, or do we start getting serious about it in terms of putting proper policies, procedures, and strategies in place to make it work and to make it enforceable?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a clear position. I don't know what you think of it, Stephen, and maybe also to consider this question as well, because with acts you can be too early or too late, but also for standards you can be too early and then you hamper innovation. You can also be too late and then you're behind the fact. And you've been the director of Logius, the main IT provider for the Dutch government, so you will no doubt have suffered from standards being either too late or too early. So what is your take on, are we generally too early or are we generally too late? What's your think? What do you think?
Well, of course, it's a mixed situation. In my personal situation, yes, I was head of the agency responsible for all the standardized digital infrastructure of the Dutch government. But I had this beautiful double role because I was also doing the secretary of the Dutch Standardization Board. So I could push the button when I needed a standard. So that was a really beautiful thing, and I really liked the race talk because it brought back many memories of the more than 10 years that I've been heavily involved in the Dutch standardization, as well as the EU standardization, by the way. Now, let me say it like this. In 2019, a group of Dutch civil servants went to Silicon Valley to see what was going on. And we were expecting to see all these beautiful possibilities of trading data, where in fact we saw that this was not a promise for the future, but this was actually happening in Silicon Valley. So, for example, says something about my personal background coming from the Dutch Royal Navy. When you ask yourself, where are the strategic oil reserves being situated in the Netherlands? This is actually open data. So this is not even something that certain dubious organizations are trying to collect and then sell. No, it's actually open data. So then you simply hire a plane, take a bomb with you, and there you go with your strategic resources. And so these civil servants were actually totally amazed at what was going on in Silicon Valley. And then they asked this question, and do you feel any responsibility as to what is going to happen with these data? And the standard answer always was, that is a very good question. Meaning, we don't feel any responsibility whatsoever. Our game is to collect data and sell it. What others will do with those data is not our concern, let alone our responsibility. So it's about the hammer that was once designed for a certain purpose, and then someone else found out that it was also a very nice tool to have when you want to hurt someone else. And then the manufacturer of the hammer says, well, I'm not responsible for that. That's a criminal act. You can't hold me responsible. The beauty of this conversation this afternoon is that apparently we all agree that there are some ethical issues concerning sharing data. And all in our own way and in our own projects, we are very, we feel very responsible to have a proper handling of data. And acts like the Data Governance Act are actually meant for those situations where people don't feel that responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not on the table quite by coincidence, I think, in our discussion this afternoon. But this is what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also a discussion for me about responsibilities in terms of, can you hold an organization responsible? Or should you go into holding individual CEOs, for example, responsible? And I recall, I don't know what happened, it probably went lost with all these elections and Brexit, but some years ago in the UK, there was a proposal to actually hold CEOs of the major the major platforms personally responsible for any misuse of data that was going on. And well, then I thought, now we're talking. Because if you want to fight these situations, and if you really are worried, and I am personally really worried, that this is a major threat to further developments, then these are the ways that you should inquire.
So you would think that the approach that is now taken by the proposed AI regulation, which is meant to look at high-risk AI applications, that you say, well, we might have built that into the Data Governance Act as well, and not only target AI, but to target data usage in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Then probably the Data Governance Act would have been even later. But
well,
but
yes,
I think,
no. That's the other thing. In the Digitransscope, at least in my chapter, I referred to a discussion I had in the Netherlands with the highest council about laws always being behind, and regulation always being behind. And so we're now experimenting in the Netherlands not to speed up lawmaking, because, well, that's a whole different ballgame. But we are trying to limit laws to the real values and to the core principles, and not going into all these procedural details, which make them very complex, which make them very hard to comply to and to supervise. And of course, Freek, you know this horrible situation at the moment in the Netherlands, where the childcare lawmaking has had some very devastating effects, using AI to speed up looking for fraud, going along with a political climate in which fraud was such a hot topic that we, without discussing it, implicitly changed trust in citizens, in distrust of citizens. And now we have this horrible situation that we really don't know how to fix exactly at the moment. And this is the kind of situation I'm talking about. What went wrong in that law? It went wrong in that they were only interested in the details, and they forgot the essential principles on which it should be based.
The biggest goal that you're actually striving for. Yeah, they forgot about that. And that also links to a question from the audience, where the question is, do you think it will have enough impact? So that is also exactly the goal that you're striving for, that you are now so describing so prominently. I'm curious, Mark and Ray, what do you think about how what the effect of regulations will be on the right levels of people making decisions.
Well, to pick up on where Stephen just left off, Stephen left off rather, is there's a middle ground. Well, actually, it's not a middle ground. Let's just reverse that back a minute. From a legislation point, we need to have a legal entity that we can actually pursue. Okay, and the legal entity is the corporation, like the organization in this instance. But you can't put a corporation in the dock, So from a prosecution point of view, there's no personal responsibility. There is corporate responsibility, and then corporate responsibility normally, as the audience member said, it's normally a fine and it's monetary. But the problem with fines is that they're not based on the income of the company. And some of these companies, they generate such revenue that the fines just are nonsensical to them. And they're quite happy to go paying fines from now until in perpetuity for an infinite amount of time, because their revenue versus fine ratio is so large. The distance is so large that it's nothing to them. So they can play lip service to conformity and at the same time just continue on running their platforms the same way. And at such time as you have personal responsibility, where you do put a CEO or a CTO in the dock, and then they are responsible for the actions they took within the organization, then you will have a change of mindset, because you cannot hide behind the umbrella of the organization or the umbrella of the corporate entity, and that will I think start changing things. And just to pick up on the standardization regulation and the Governance Act and when they happen, I'm not being a complete naysayer on this. I think but I am actually supporting what Stefan said, that there's a little bit more of thinking and planning in advance of taking these large actions, like creating regulations and creating legislations. It needs to happen. There needs to be more planning and strategy and policy put in place first, before you jump off the cliff and say, let's create this act, and then figure out what we're going to do with it, or how we're going to enforce it, or how it's going to impact on society, and how do we fix it if it actually gets impacted incorrectly? Because this is what's happened, like in the instance that you're talking to there in the Dutch example. And my solution to that is, well, you need to co-evolve them, that you need to have a stakeholder group wide enough being consulted, that you evolve the standardization that's happening in parallel with the technical developments, in other words, the RTDI projects, in parallel with people looking at legislation and regulation implications going forward, so that none of these just jumps ahead of the other, that they all are going ahead at the same time. And until that happens, and because that's difficult to manage, people say, it's too hard, we won't do it. Okay. But sooner or later, we're going to have to invest the energy and the will to do it.
Yeah. So it's the co-evolution between the technical developments and regulatory developments. And I think that's also what Mark indicated, that now that they've been working on the federated learning, you can do many good things with it, but no doubt you will be able to think of bad things that you can do with it. So you were also indicating that probably regulation needs to pick up on these situations as well right now.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a good point, because I do share Stefan's worry a little bit about, certainly when we've been looking at machine learning and AI, and it's still, relatively speaking, in an infancy, and we're quite likely going to face a deluge of misinformation that's generated through AI. And again, back to the Data Governance Act, that wasn't possible really to take care of that at the time, right? So now we're getting to the stage where speed is important now, I think, really, to cover all of this, because I know federated learning itself is much more, it's relatively new. But once it takes off, how do you look at things like accountability in these systems, right? So because at the moment there really isn't any, right? So and I kind of touched on that towards the end of the presentation, that these are the kind of things now that we can see, oh yeah, this is now possible, this can work, it can protect data, it can protect privacy. Okay, what's next? And as you said, well, who knows what people are going to do with these things, right? So we need something in place.
Yeah, exactly. You can still use data poisoning approaches where you completely screw up some very good federated learning thing. Right. Yeah,
but it's not a long. But it's not a long step from where Mark has gone and his team have gone with Musketeer. Is you've made this huge step forward towards a trusted intermediary, and you're not really far from trusted accountability when you have trusted intermediaries. Mm-hmm. So accountability at the moment, there's no way of doing it. There's no standard way of doing it. But the fact that trust is there, and if we can guarantee the trust, then I think the accountability gets a little bit easier, because trusted intermediaries will want to be accountable.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and that's one of the kind of interesting things that with the overlap to the IDSA reference architectures, because when you consider things like trusted brokers, which, as you say, is essentially a trusted intermediary, that's a very logical place to start layering on accountability, because everybody has to go through that. Because people will look at it and say, well, we could build a federated learning system or any kind of federated system that doesn't do it that way. But then you take away all the benefits of privacy and security at the underlying levels. So, it makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, yes, Stephen.
And I think, once again, getting back to reasons to be cheerful, some 5-6 years ago, I started a policy department within the Dutch government, starting from the fact that I wanted to have a value-based digitization policy. And everybody said I was going totally crazy. That was impossible. And now we're 5-6 years later, and this is the talk of the town. Just open the newspapers, digital or otherwise, and every day this discussion is in the papers. So that's for me quite an important signal. And on the other hand, don't forget that, for example, the state of California has adopted the GDPR without any discussion, taking it as a whole, and saying what is good in the EU can't be bad for us.
Well, so, they really did this.
Yes, they did this.
Well, okay.
So we're really having a sort of export road that we can exploit somewhat more. Now we're really also the living lab of the world, having these discussions, doing the experiments and the project that Mark is working on, doing the standardization, open standardization, accountable standardization that Ray is doing. So let's not forget that in the world, everybody is looking at us as to how we are trying to have a humane way of using this technology and not stepping from it, but use it in a responsible and sensible way.
Yeah. I think that is actually a very cheerful conclusion for this session, that yes, we may conclude that at some places we're too late, but some other places we're maybe too fast or not far enough or whatever, but still we're leading the world. And I really liked your observation that California, which is by no means, they're pretty advanced in many, many cases, they adopted the GDPR. So that's one of the most wonderful things that I learned today. And at first I was a little bit worried how the different contributions would fit together in this session, but I think we have really put a lot of extremely relevant and good ingredients on the table. So I think it was a fruitful idea to combine the topics of data governance and standards in the light of the Data Governance Act. So I must really thank you all for your contributions. Also, thanks for the audience. By being here and in this webinar situation, it's always a little bit awkward because you cannot speak up. You can only use your keyboard to ask questions. And there was one usual suspect who did that. Thank you, Tjerk. You're always good for a question. But I think it was, at least for me, it was inspiring and interesting. I guess it will have been the same for you. So with these cheerful words, let me conclude the session. And again, thanking you all and looking forward to meeting you next time.
Yeah, and also to echo what Freek has said, like, I mean, really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. So thanks very much, Mark and Steve.
Thank you, Ray.
So did I. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.